Okay.
I'm Betty Howard, and I'm 97 years old.
Okay.
I am Kirkland Wheeler. I am the minister at Kingston Church of Christ. Been here for what, is it 18 months now, I guess. So anyways, that's where I guess we all come from here. So anyways, you have any questions? You want me to say anything else?
Well, I think what we're thinking of is name just for people's names.
Oh, you want me to no. I think everybody ought to just stand up and introduce myself.
Well, that's
my name is,
okay.
Elizabeth Stubblefield.
Okay.
I'm Brian Woodley.
Okay, Brian.
Scott Woodley.
Scott.
Steve Goodpasture. My parents in there.
I know all about this guy.
We went hiking together.
Yeah.
Della Elliott.
George Anderson. Martin Carlson.
Say I'm red. Can you stand up, stand over?
Matt Wheeler.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, make sure,
Don't forget up there.
Oh, yeah, over here.
I'm Bill Scott and I'm running for president.
okay.
This is Linda.
Okay.
I'm not.
Oh, that's great. Oh, you all, and I know that you came from Kingston services. We had normal services like I think you're used to. Then we had a catered barbecue luncheon. So sorry you couldn't join us on that. Then we've come back out here, and if you have your booklet, I'll get some highlights. This was the result of about a year of pretty intensive research, where that I was able to go to the Rome County Historical Museum and Archives there at Kingston. I got to know what is the guy's name? Is it Bob? The guy that's the researcher there. Such a neat guy. And he actually had a file for the Harriman Church of Christ. So I told him, when we get this finished, he's going to put it in our file. So was able to do some really good research. Found some of the original handwritten meeting notes from the leaders here, dating back into the 1947. So we were just looking at some of the original resources for the booklet. As I pointed out, this might be a little redundant for some of you that we've already gone through, but this is okay because I want those who have the booklet to appreciate it. I want you to notice on page 2, and we went over this in our sermon, and we need to know this. There are both healthy and unhealthy traditions in the church. It's hard for us sometimes to think about healthy ones because as on Sunday morning, we're going through the book of Matthew. When you look at Jesus' teachings and how he teaches about traditions, they don't get too good marks as far as Jesus is concerned. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that the Pharisees were using their traditions, as Jesus says, to nullify the will of God. Now that's when it gets serious. But there are, as Paul used in his 3 times, at least in his letters, this idea of apostolic traditions, things you've received and what you've been taught, and customs that are healthy for your religious growth and instruction. And that's one of the things that we have wanted to try and emphasize here, is not only that we've been here for 100 years, but I suspect in some ways that our worship assembly this morning would not have been a whole lot unlike what was practiced in 1924. And probably you would recognize, most those of you who came from Kingston just now, a lot of what we did is probably a lot of what you did. And some of those traditions in the assembly are good, they're healthy, there's the reason they've been around for 100 years. You know, stuff that's important usually sticks around, and there's a reason for that. So just be aware of that, a biblical rationale. One of the things that I pointed out, in 1924, A.J. Rivers came here from Nashville. And Rockwood at the time had a minister that was working with another minister from Crossville. And in this entire area, they began having tent meetings. And this congregation, as well as others in the area, are the result of early tent meetings. And I don't know, some of you may have been to a tent meeting. I mean, every now and then somebody will have a tent meeting. But that was very normal back in the 20s and 30s, that all over East Tennessee, when churches began to be planted, they would start with a gospel meeting, usually a lot of times early on, it was 2 weeks. Then it went from Sunday to Sunday, but there were tent meetings where that as a result of baptisms out of the tent meeting, that's where congregations would get started. So in 1924, there were 29 members that started this congregation. And originally it was known as the South Harriman Church. And they ended up building a building, and the building's still there. It's on South Woody Street. And they met there until 1939, and that's when this building was built. And in 1954, as I mentioned this morning, they changed the whole front entrance because used to there was a what do you call it? A canopy and an entrance that would face the highway that way. But then they changed it because they enlarged the auditorium, put the nursery in, the 2 bathrooms. And so in order to do that, because of, I guess, building restrictions on where they could go, they made the entrance to the building over here on the side. So that was changed. So over the years, the church has been here. I talked about Jesus, where he talked about the church needs to be a light on a hill, or, Christians, don't hide your light under a bushel, be like a city that's a light set on a hill. Well, we as a church, we're kind of on the hill here. So we want to remain a light to the world, to the community set here on the hill. And so in the 20s, I mentioned this earlier, I was able to talk to the public librarian here in town. And they had just received from the University of Tennessee Library 5 thumb drives that had the digitized copies of the Harriman record in 1924 and 25. So I was able to read through 2 years worth of the Harriman record to see if I could find in the newspaper where there was an announcement of the church opening up and starting here. And I really couldn't find anything. But I got home that evening, I told Nancy, I was like, woo, I feel like I've been living 100 years ago. Because you go through 2 years of newspaper that came out daily, and you spend all day reading that, it's like you stepped back in time machine. It was really amazing. But I couldn't find anything. Another thing that I could not find was, and many of you know this, if you go into either the archival museum or if you go into the Harriman Library here in town, if you've ever seen that great big thick book by Pulliam on the establishment of Harriman as a town and also Roane County, I forget how many chapters that thing's got. It's got like 50 chapters. It's huge. He has one entire chapter for the flood of 29. And those of you who've lived in this area, you know about the flood of 29. I couldn't find anything so far in that chapter or in the newspaper about the church's response or relief efforts to that devastating flood to Harriman. Now, there may have been, but so far I can't find anything. Another thing that surprised me was I can't find anything so far in church records about relief efforts that the church was involved in during World War II. And I'm sure the church did a lot of things here as other churches did, all kinds of community projects, relief efforts, things that they would send overseas to the boys and girls that were in the armed forces. But right now I can't find anything on that. So I've told people this morning, if you know something and you find some information that looks like a gold mine, please let me know, because we want to continue putting this together. 2 big things that I mentioned that you'll see in the booklet. again, part of our history. So those of you who are Churches of Christ, you know this. In the early 50s, many of our churches went through a conflict that were split. And it was very painful for a lot of churches. And those particular churches were struggling with an issue where that people were making it sort of, well, not sort of, it really was. It was a test of fellowship, and they were teaching it is wrong for the church to take money out of the treasury and support orphan homes or even Christian colleges. And I won't go into all the reasons they said all that. That's a whole different story. But that was what they were pushing. And the thing that's interesting, and I noticed this when I was doing research for this historical booklet, I thought, I recognize this name. One of the ministers that was here, and I got to poke around, and sure enough, the preacher that was here at the time, A.C. Grider, in the early 50s, he became one of the main leaders of this, what was called anti-institutional movement in Churches of Christ. And wherever he went, and others that worked with him, they were intentional on splitting congregations over this issue. It was very ugly, very painful for a lot of churches. And it was really sad. Now, interestingly, apparently the church here at Harriman didn't go along with that, even though the preacher here tried to push it. And as a researcher, I think I figured out 3 reasons why. Number one, A.J. Rivers in 1924, he came from Nashville, and he was very well off. He ended up purchasing, you all know it today probably as Acme Block and Brick. Well, when he bought it, it was Acme Block and Tile Company. But he had a lot of connections to people in Nashville that were very much invested in helping orphan homes and that sort of thing. So he would have been against that push. And then the congregation here had speakers come from Lipscomb University and would have had very close ties. And so in one of the, I can't remember what year it was, 1945, it'll be after that. It would have been 50, 51, been 56, somewhere along there. In the business meetings, it just said, the minister resigned and he's gone to Georgia. Well, apparently what happened is this minister brought back to the congregation here some tapes that they recorded some of these very lively debates, and he tried to get the congregation to go along with that, and apparently the congregation wasn't going to have it. And so it was just like, this issue's over, and so he left. And so fortunately, the church here did not split over that. Now, another big issue in the life of our congregation here was in the 1980s. A lot of Churches of Christ had fits over this. And let me see what page, just so if you've got your booklet with you. Nancy, I think we had some more come in that need some booklet. Please raise your hand so you can get a booklet.
They have to stand up and introduce themselves, right?
What's that?
They have to stand up and introduce themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, okay, everybody else did. You gotta stand up and introduce yourself.
I'm Kate Roper. I live over in Kingston.
Okay.
Elise. Also Kingston.
And Nancy back there. Yes,
Mike and Sally Houston from Kingston.
wonderful. Fantastic. In the booklet, if you'll turn to, now what's interesting on page 4, there's an original picture of the building down on Woody Street. You can see that. What we don't have is kind of sad. On the original picture that we got, on the back of that picture, there are no names. So if you could take a magnifying glass and identify streets for us, that would be helpful. We don't know who they are. Although I suspect if we had names, some of you here might know some of them. Let's see. I'm wanting to turn to what page? On the pages 14 and 15, I need to point this out. But this was new to me, and I thought I knew a lot about restoration history. Some of you who are older may have known this. because I was just young at the time. In 1960, you may remember, this is the election year for when JFK was elected as president. Especially in September and October of 1960, a lot of churches, and not just Churches of Christ, but especially Churches of Christ, a lot of churches bought 1,000 copies at once. And this is on page, where's that picture? Page 14. 15, yeah, top page 15. There was a booklet that was written and published by V.E. Howard, and the title is The White House, American or Roman? And there was a lot of fear all over the United States in 1960 that if we elected a Catholic president, Catholicism would rule the land and communism would come in with it at the same time. And so this book was bought by a lot of churches, and I mean all over the United States, not just Churches of Christ. And I don't know how many thousands of them were published and sent all over. But I thought that was a fascinating dynamic that I didn't know anything about. But apparently it was based on the fear of what people thought might happen. So just be aware of how significant the fall of 1960 was in America in Churches of Christ. And the church here purchased 1,000 of them and distributed them all over Harriman. The other is, I want to point this out. This is on page 24. And it is an article published that I found that Freeman Hicks, the minister who used to be here, he wrote an article called What Grace Means to Me. And for those of you who remember back in the 80s, there was a huge question in our fellowship, and I don't know if you know this, but churches divided over this also. And it was the idea of what grace was. And I think what people were hearing was if you preach grace, then you don't have to obey. I think that's what they thought they were hearing. That's not what was being presented, but that's what people thought they were hearing. And as a result, it became very divisive. The congregation here split in two because of that. I got to hear before Freeman died, his own experiences of being here while that happened. It was very painful for him. But I give a historical background because from what was written in just the notes of the business meetings, the fact that the church split and now we're a smaller congregation, there's another one that went on the other side of town. Without the historical background, you wouldn't know what happened. But it happened all over our brotherhood. And there were churches that were able to kind of negotiate that and figure out what is the place of grace, not only in the plan of salvation, but also where does grace fit in how you live. So there were churches that were able to kind of work through that. There were a lot that weren't. And it became very divisive, and churches were split in two over it. And what was really cool was I discovered this bulletin article in my research by Freeman, and it would have been 8 years after that split here. And what you get when you read that in the booklet, I thought it was so important it needed to be in there so that you could see his heart, what he was thinking, and through his seasoned years of ministry to come to the point where he really understood what God's grace was. And I just think it's important to know that. And it had a huge impact on our congregation here. Let's see, so I want a couple other things I want to point out. I'm just pointing out some highlights for those of you, so you can take the booklet home and of course read it on your own. Oh, I mentioned this earlier. On page 28 and following, the congregation here in I'm almost getting the year right, 62, I think. It was raised in the business meeting that the history of the church here had too many ministers come and go, and that they only stay a year or two, then they would go. And so in the business meeting, it was decided, okay, we got to do something about that. And that's when the church here began to invest in young people, anyone that wanted to go to be prepared for ministry. They made sure they were supporting someone going to school to prepare for ministry, which was really interesting because they were able to invest in Freeman. And guess what? Freeman and Agnes came back to work here in the congregation. And so they were able to get even a direct impact of that earlier decision, which was wonderful. They had a youth minister here at the same time. His name was Mike Matheny. And come to find out, I knew that name. I thought, I know Mike. Well, come to find out, Mike and I had gone to school together in some classes. I thought, aha, that's how I know Mike. He finished schooling and ended up teaching, working with youth ministers and missionaries, training, but he taught for 10 years at Lipscomb University in Nashville. And then at age 50, he had a brain tumor and died, which was really tragic. The Lipscomb campus took it pretty hard. So did all the young people that just loved him. One year, I think he was voted the most likable professor or something on campus, but just a wonderful young man. But he spent last 10 years of his life preparing missionaries and young people for ministry. So it's interesting that we as a congregation had a hand in that. And you still don't know today what seed were planted and are still growing in the kingdom, all because of that early commitment in 1962 to help people prepare for ministry. See if there's anything else I want to highlight here. Oh yeah, I talked about earlier. Did I talk about here too? Oh, especially one event back in the 1920s that had a huge impact on the church, or at 1930s. On page 6 and following, there were a group of girls picking blackberries one Sunday afternoon. And two of the girls, I think one was 7 years old, the other was 10 years old. They were walking down the tracks, actually walking the tracks. If you've ever remember growing up walking the tracks, they didn't hear the train coming behind them, and they were run over by the train. And there was a double funeral at the South Harriman church before it moved here into town. And that accident apparently had a huge impact on the congregation for years to follow. The funeral was at the church building. And of course, you know, everybody at school came, their schoolmates. It was a huge funeral. And it was very sad, but it impacted the church for a number of years. There was another reference to something unique about a funeral. There was a gentleman that was, I think, 95 years old. His funeral was at the Harriman church. And at that time, I think it was in the late 40s, at that time, he was recognized as the oldest living Civil War veteran here in East Tennessee, and he fought for the Confederacy. We think, from what I can tell, that he was a member of the congregation. So there's a little interesting historical note in that particular episode. Let's see if there's anything. Yeah, there were a couple other things I wanted to point out. On page 34, there are all the ministers and the years that they served. And so I thought that was helpful for the congregation to be aware of. And then because, and you'll read, when you have time to read this in the book, historical book at your own leisure, page 45 and following, we have a special section on the Sevier Drive congregation here in town. There's always been a very special relationship there because when the building was first built, Freeman Hicks, who was here and working with the church, actually was able to help lay some of the bricks by hand. And I got to talk to him about that wonderful first few days of the history of the Sevier Drive congregation. And then through the years, there's always been the good relationship between the two congregations and the support of the Women's Inspiration Day that the Sevier Drive Church has. So there's a great history between the Black congregation and this congregation. And we wanted to make sure that got in this booklet. And it was funny because I thought, now who do I talk to? Well, I think it was Betty, but somebody made sure that Trellis, Trellis called me. And I had a wonderful conversation with Trellis, couldn't hardly get off the phone. She was telling one story after another. They were great. I just wish I could have recorded them. But she said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you our history along with some pictures. And she, I mean, within an hour, she sent them. And so we put them in the booklet here because we wanted to honor the Sevier Drive Church too, because we've had such a close relationship. Now, there's one other story, and I don't know if those of you at Sevier Drive remember this. Back in the late 60s, during the civil rights movement and all kinds of stuff going on, because Freeman and others of this congregation helped build the church over at Sevier Drive, there was a lot of persecution that went on. I didn't know that until I sat down and talked with Agnes a little bit, and Freeman gave me some information. It kind of makes your hair curl. But because this congregation was known for helping with the Sevier church, they suffered persecution. And I'm like, that is so sad. You know, you would think people get beyond that. But anyway, because they went through that together, it sort of cemented, I think, made stronger that relationship between Harriman Church here and also the Sevier Drive Church. Anything else? Yeah, if you'll look on pages 48, 49, and 50, you'll see all of the resources that were consulted as we put the book together. And I've put a word out, two things. If you all know someone that would like to have a copy of this historical booklet and they have a strong connection or interest in the Harriman congregation, please let me know because we'll make sure they get a copy. And then the other thing is, if you come across anything that is related to the history of our church, maybe you know somebody's got a gold mine of bulletins laying around somewhere. If you come across something that you think could help us continue to update our historical booklet, please let me know because I'll be excited. One thing that wasn't able to happen, I was hoping it would, I got a hold of, remember we talked about A.J. Rivers being the original planter of the congregation here in 1924. I got to talk to A.J. Rivers III. I didn't know this, but there is a fourth. There's four. And he said on back of one of his trucks, and I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking for it. So if y'all see it, take a picture of it and send it to me. On the back of one of his trucks, all four generations, pictures of the A.J. Rivers are on the back of a dump truck. It's got the 1924 A.J. Rivers and then the other three. And so I went to the Acme Block and Brick that's over by the interstate, and I didn't see it there. So if you all ever see that thing on the road and you see all four of their pictures on the back of that truck, take a picture of it and send it to me. I don't want to belabor this, but as you can tell, for the last year, I've been really excited about the research that went into this. Nancy and I have been here, we're in our 7th year with the congregation here. The longer that I was here, the richer I knew that the history was. I thought, wow, when it comes up 2004, we need to have something pulled together for the people, the congregation here. One thing that's interesting is there's also been in the history, and I saw this a little bit, those of you who are from Kingston, maybe you can enlighten me on this, but in years past, I discovered there were some events that the Harriman Church cooperated with the Kingston Church. Do any of you know what some of those were? I know there was like a tent meeting way back when. There was also cooperation together on a radio program. So have y'all heard or anything about that or run across any information? Anybody know? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but don't mean to. I'm just interested in that. So if any of y'all from Kingston, if you run across any records or any stories or anything that relates to even the relationship that we have with Kingston, we would love to have that part of the picture. Yeah, Agnes?
I think I was a young person when the Kingston congregation started, but I'm often thinking that Rockwood Church of Christ and Harriman Church of Christ were already started.
Yeah.
And they helped Kingston get started.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Those two congregations.
That's
Harriman
right.
and Rockwood helped
And-
Kingston get started.
You know, and in the book, there's a book, and y'all from Kingston need to know this. I can almost tell you real quick. There is a resource on churches in Roane County. what is it? See if I can find it real quick. Yeah, it's the resource on churches in Roane County. Anyway, there's a section on the Kingston church. And I was so focused on the Harriman church and stuff that was there. I didn't take time at the moment to read what was connected with the Kingston church. But those of you from Kingston, just be aware that there is a book there in the library on the churches and the history of those in Roane County. So that might be helpful for you all. And Jim, let's see. Do those of you at Kingston, do you have a written history? Have you all put together a written history for your congregation?
We have one of milestones. We have a history of milestones documented.
Oh, okay. I'll get with that. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that. And it is important for churches to be aware of their milestones, isn't it? I mean, that's critical. And one of the things that we talked about this morning, and I'll just share with you all who this is new for you, but how important it is to be aware of our religious heritage and that is deeply a part of our identity, where we came from. I'm shocked at the people through the years in Churches of Christ that don't know our own history. They don't know restoration history. They don't know where we came from. They don't know how we got started, don't know why we got started. And I'm like, really? And so I've kind of made it a passion of mine with every congregation I've been. Folks, we need to know our heritage is part of our identity and who we are. So, but yeah, those milestones are very important for church members to know. Anything else? I could talk all day long, but I don't want to keep you all. Yes.
Several may know this, but two of A.J. Rivers' grandsons are members of our congregation in Kingston.
Really?
Jim and Arthur.
Fantastic. So would Arthur be Art number 4? Would he be AJ number 4?
No.
No, he wouldn't be. I thought I found out that there's 2 streams of the Rivers family. Is that right? Do you know? Because I think the original AJ had a brother that came with him. I think that's right. And so there's first and second cousins of Rivers all over here, I found out. But yeah, okay, cool. Well, I want to get in touch with them and continue doing some interviewing. That's wonderful. Anything else? Thank you for that.